Okay, so this is going on right now. A disciplinary hearing for a police officer in the York region. This guy, a black police officer, shows up at a field party where he's called the N-word several times. And one of the people there says, we should lynch that N-word officer. The officer files his notes after they make the arrests and do everything, and they charge one guy. And he says, I was called some racial slurs in his notes. But then he runs into the same guy a couple of weeks later and the guy says, if it wasn't for your badge and that gun on you right now, I would beat the you-know-what out of you. He takes that as a threat, as threatening an officer. He arrests the guy. And then, subsequent to that, he is brought up on disciplinary charges within the force because he failed to report the first incident. Even though it was in his notes, I didn't know what he had to report. We're joined right now by, so they're threatening to discipline this black police officer because he didn't whine about being called the N-word. I mean, if you've seen the movie about Jackie Robinson recently, they tell Jackie, to take it and to be a gentleman and all that kind of stuff. And you know what? I think if you're doing your job and you are a police officer, you might have to take whether or not somebody's calling you a pig or any number of different things. It probably comes with the territory. If somebody goes too far, then you might arrest him. Just as this black police officer arrested a guy who said, I would beat the you-know-what out of him. But he didn't do anything when somebody said he should be lynched. These people are among us, by the way. These people who would say these things to a black person live in the 416-905. 416-872-1010. Star Talk is star 8255. Ross Mclean joins us right now. He's a former police officer, crime specialist. He is at the Tribunal hearing. Ross, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, good to join you. And great of Newstalk 1010 to stay on top of this story from the time it broke. I've heard it discussed on numerous shows to find out just what's going on.
Okay. His brother, the black police officer's brother, says the whole thing doesn't make any sense to me. It seems like a witch hunt.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what occurred to me when I first saw it, and I started looking into the case to find the evidence. And, I was suggesting that if the chief who wants to, die on this hill over this topic, it better be a good charge with good reasons for laying it. And I have to say, what I've been able to find out so far about the charges is it's weak, and I can't even believe that they've been laid, Jim.
Well, let me ask you, you were a police officer, and there's got to be a line where you run into people who are going to call you any number of different awful things. You're a pig, why don't you go eat donuts, all that kind of stuff. And, I would think that might have to come with the territory, but when they go over the line, as this person went over the line here and said, if it wasn't for that badge and that gun, I'd come over there and I'd beat the you-know-what out of you, that's a threat.
Yeah, and that's exactly when the officer decided to take actions, is when he was actually threatened. He didn't do it over the words. And you're absolutely right. I've been called lots of names, both on and off the job, Jim. But, that shouldn't affect you when you're doing your work. And what's going on here, Jim, is they're holding this tribunal. I mean, this is a funny thing for justice. I've been against this whole process of the way the Police Act works. It's being held in a banquet hall at a Howard Johnson's. I mean, it's a banquet hall of justice here. And
who's deciding his fate? The chief of the police, the York Regional Police?
Well, this is the other thing. The chief is the one who asked for him to be investigated. Then the chief decided to lay the charges against him. The chief is the one who pays for the prosecution. The person who's serving as his adjudicator or his arbitrator is currently a working superintendent who reports to that chief, who's sitting supposedly as an independent hearing officer on this. It's just bizarre. I mean, I don't think any one of us would want to be
Let's go through that again. The chief is effectively the on the side of the prosecution because he asked for the hearing?
He's the one laying the charge, yeah.
And the person who is deciding his fate is somebody who answers to the chief?
Yeah, he's a working superintendent who works for the chief. And, the other part that's funny about this, and this has nothing to do with this arbitrator in particular, I find the Police Act just to be totally broken. We need to relook at it. But I asked the one lawyer here, I said, out of all the lawyers who are on, the side of the table, the prosecution side, the defense side, I said, who has the least legal training out of anybody here? And it's the person who's the arbitrator. I mean, right now they're arguing some case law that nobody knew about except one of the lawyers is very senior who works for, who's helping to defend Constable Muirhead. And he said those points are right off. He immediately produced the case law on it.
Okay, I got to take a break here. Constable Muirhead, for everyone who does not know, is the black police officer in question. And a second here, what is the actual allegation? Is the allegation that he did not report the threat in that somebody said he should be lynched? Because he did report that he was the victim of some racial slurs. Ross Mclean is with us. He's a former police officer and a crime specialist. He's actually in this tribunal deciding the fate of a black police officer who failed to report that somebody yelled at him, hey, that guy should be lynched. And he's facing a disciplinary hearing right now. And do we know everything about this thing? Something smells of getting Al Capone on tax evasion. 2:45 on In-Depth Radio in Toronto. Newstalk 1010 Time Saver Traffic. This is an incredible story. It's happening right now in the York region. In fact, a hearing's on right now, a tribunal to decide the fate of a police officer, a black police officer who was called the N-word a couple of times at a field party. Somebody said that guy should be lynched. He didn't report that threat. Subsequent to that, somebody at the same party said at a gas station to him, if it wasn't for that gun and for that badge, I'd come over and I'd beat the hell out of you right now. That guy was arrested, and then the chief found out, well, why didn't you report the last report or the last threat, even though he reported that people were saying racially insensitive things to him. So, Ross, what's the actual allegation, that he didn't report the lynching threat?
Well, we're trying to get to that now. That's why they're updating their testimony now about how the charges came up. Now, the best that I can figure, and I haven't sat here for the start of the evidence, the best that's been reported so far is when the officer had seen this person after the lynch threat, following days, and he was threatened by him. The officer arrested him. There seems to be a claim that they're saying that he said that the threat was racially motivated, and the York police chief is of the opinion that it wasn't racially motivated. And I think he's saying that the officer saying it was racially motivated is some kind of misconduct. It is very, very convoluted, the story here.
Oh, so the original story that we heard perhaps is that the threats were definite threats, but they weren't linked to race.
Right. Although I will give a man who's lived as a black man in this country for as many years as this officer has in uniform, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt in knowing when he's being racially bothered as opposed to my judging it.
What's the consequence here? Could he lose his job, or is he going to get marked down? Is he going to get banged down a rank?
Well, there's always the possibility of losing your job. There's the possibility of being demoted for a number of years. So there are different aspects to it.
Do you get the feeling that they just didn't like him and maybe it was something else and they're trying to get him on this?
Look, I'm talking to a lot of officers up here, York Regional officers that are up here. Some retired, some very senior positions, who are officers of color themselves, and they're up here supporting the officer because they don't believe that this is the right way to handle the problem that this chief is trying to deal with. They think that there should have been some kind of sit-down talk and work it out rather than going to this length. So that's why there's so many people here to support him, Jim.
Ross, great story. Thank you very much for reporting on it. Ross Mclean is a former police officer, crime specialist. Right now he's at that tribunal hearing of a black officer who is allegedly threatened by someone and failed to report it. And so he didn't report it. He's facing this discipline.